So we are back to study On the Way to the Light. Let me share the screen here. We are starting today chapter 24, which is Spiritism and the Great Transitions. I'm going to ask Philip to read for us. Soraya is having problems with her camera, so can you read for us?
Can the characters be a little bigger?
Yeah, I was going to say that. The characters are so small.
Really?
They're pretty big.
They're very tiny. Mine are tiny.
Yeah, it may be a system.
The same I always do. I haven't changed anything.
It's coming out big for me, so I'm not sure why they're seeing it as small.
I see it. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Philip, can you read for us?
Sure.
Sorry, that's how I always use. So I cannot change. It's the maximum on my computer.
Okay.
Spiritism and the Great Transitions, the Abolition of Slavery. The 19th century was characterized by many advances. Along with the significant phenomena of the scientific and industrial development that shook it, there were also highly important political events that renewed the social concepts of all the peoples of the white race. One of these great events was the abolition of slavery. Fulfilling the orders of the divine master, his messengers from the invisible realm labored with governments to facilitate the victory of freedom. The decision of the Congress of Vienna disapproving the trafficking of free humans had found deep repercussions in every country. In 1834, the English Parliament voted to abolish slavery in all the colonies of the Great Britain. In 1850, Brazil abolished the African trafficking of slaves. In the revolt of 1848, France ordered the abolition of slavery in its territories. In 1861, Alexander II of Russia ordered all the serfs who labored under the regime of slavery to be freed. And from 1861 into 1865, a devastating war raged on the hospitable soil of the United States in the War of Secession. Socialism. Grand ideas flourished in the mentality.
Oh, sorry, Philip. Sorry, there was a top line here, which ended with the victory of freedom and progressive ideas in the great nation. You didn't see that?
I can't read the top line. It's above my screen.
Okay. All right. So we're talking here beginning of the 19th century. We studied last month. You studied with Elmo the 19th century and all the transformations there. One of the big transitions characteristics of the 19th century was the official abolition of slavery throughout the world. Again, we are talking about official here. There are, until today, there are spots of slavery, illegal slavery around the world, but legal slavery was abolished in most of the world in the 19th century. And what Emmanuel says here is that the Congress of Vienna was the first step. And the Congress of Vienna was a congress, was not a formal congress, was more of an informal congress, was an international diplomatic conference that tried to reconstitute the European political order after the downfall of Napoleon. We studied in past months Napoleon and his mission and how he failed on his mission that he brought from the spiritual world of spreading the ideas, the new ideas of freedom that France brought with the French Revolution. He ended up invading all Europe and trying to dominate Europe, to rule Europe militarily, not instead of with ideas. And he failed, and there were many wars. And the Congress of Vienna tried and succeeded to reestablish the main frontiers and the countries in Europe. Of course, it's not as we know today. There are several kingdoms, and Germany, for instance, was all divided in many small kingdoms. Italy was divided in kingdoms also. The Vatican ruled part of it. But basically what is today the UK, at that time with Ireland still belonging to the UK, and then France and Portugal and Spain had the same configuration that it has today, right? Holland and Belgium were one country, the Kingdom of the Dutch, of the Netherlands. Prussia dominated a large part of Poland. Other part was dominated by Russian Empire. Denmark was as it is today. So to reestablish the divisions that Napoleon had made, they had this Congress that solved most of the issues between the countries, were able to find peace. Even in the middle of it, Napoleon came back and tried to reestablish his domination, his ruling of France, and was defeated after 100 days in the famous Battle of Waterloo. So by the end of in 1815, when Napoleon was definitely defeated and exiled, the signatories of the treaty finished it. So amongst many of the things that they decided on the Congress were, most of them were frontiers between countries, who got what. So each country, what they had the right. France was part of it, besides being a defeated country, was part of it, and was able to maintain most of its territories. Lost some of his border territories, small regions to Prussia, to other countries, but mainly maintained it. But one of the decisions of the Congress was to condemn the trade of slaves, the trafficking of slaves. That was condemned, but it was not, of course, officially imposed, because each country has their own issues. But starting there, we see here, as Emmanuel says, that the English Parliament voted to abolish slavery in all colonies, 1834. Brazil, in a sense, was forced by Great Britain to abolish the trafficking of slaves in 1850. It would take Brazil another 38 years to completely abolish slaves. Slavery was abolished in Brazil in 1888 by the daughter of the then Emperor of Brazil. France in 1848 abolished slavery in its territories. In 1861, Alexander II of Russia abolished slavery. It was called serfs there. And then we know very well the history in this country of the War of Secession, the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, the devastating war that this country had between the North and the South to completely abolish slaves. We know that the North didn't have slaves. The slavery was already unlawful in some of the northern states here, but the South still had slaves and tried to secede from the United States to keep the slavery, but was defeated. We know through Spiritism that the natural order of progress, slavery is something that it doesn't make it makes sense because we are all equal. So the natural consequence of our evolution as human beings would be the abolition of slavery. But we had in some places to go through disputes, through war, and several changes. But you know, the abolition of slavery, it was a very important piece of the spread of Spiritism, because when Spiritism brings that we are all equal, we are all created equal, and there is no distinctions of race, of gender, of anything. You have to have a more prepared society. And we discussed this last month, why Spiritism appeared in the 19th century. It couldn't appear before that, because society was ready for it. You had ideas already spreading, and you had the separation of the church and science and the scientific community rejecting everything that was spiritual and moving to the other extreme. And Spiritism came to bring the middle ground, which is the alliance between science and the religious aspect or the moral aspect, a philosophical understanding of how the world, who we are, and how the world should work through the improvement of us all. Okay, comments, questions here? Luis?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I fixed my microphone here. No, I just find it very interesting that Emmanuel here mentions the serfs in Russia, because whenever we talk about slavery, we are very focused on the slavery of the Africans during that period, and the 16th, 17th, 18th century. And actually, there was slave work all over the world, and not only with African slaves and the trafficking, but also in many places, including in Russia, where serfs were still slaves. So I find it very interesting. It's being mentioned by Emmanuel.
Yeah, we commented that this book shows the history of humanity, but mostly from the European side, right? What happens in the European world? Because if we talk about slavery in Asia, you had the Japanese making other slaves, the Chinese. Until the 20th century, you have the Japanese making Koreans and Japanese and Chinese slaves, and this is a sort of dispute until today, and resentment between the nations in Asia, right? In India, of course, you had some, before it was abolished by Great Britain in 1834, you had some forms of slaves also. So yes, but what became, you know, in the history of the world, we have to understand that Emmanuel focused on the great slave movement coming from Africa, which was without a doubt the largest slavery movement in the world, right? Removing people from Africa and bringing to the American colonies and other places to serve as slaves, and that's, you know, which with all the consequences that we see until today, right? We still have unresolved issues because of slavery in many places, right? In this country and in many other countries, because of resentment, of unjust treatment, of even when slavery was abolished here, the discrimination against the Black community, it took another 100 years to become outlawed, right? Only in the 60s it became outlaw. Again, officially there is no discrimination. We are not going to enter into the unofficial discrimination that still exists, and you know, there are people here more able to talk about it than I am. But officially, it took another 100 years for discrimination to be outlawed in this country. So with this, everything that happens creates consequences, and all this slavery brought a lot of consequences that takes generations for it to be solved. But you know, bringing Spiritism to the discussion, we know that we are all equal before God, and everything that we do create consequences. So those that are still insisting in discriminating and causing harm to those that are different, they will have to face the consequences in new incarnations. That they will, you know, they will be oppressed like they oppress today, or even if they, you know, if they can reincarnate on Earth, they maybe have the opportunity of repair, or if they insist on their evil actions, they may not even have the opportunity of reincarnating here on Earth, as we're going to see. Emmanuel talks a little bit about this later in this chapter, about those that insist on practicing evil. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so another very controversial subject, socialism. Philip, you're mute.
Grand ideas flourished in the mentality of the time. The ancient doctrines of complete equality resurfaced. Socialism made its appearance, proposing visceral and immediate reforms. Some idealists referred to utopia by Thomas More, or the perfect republic idealized by Plato. Anarchical alliances were formed, as well as societies of a universal character. A sociological revolution with unforeseen consequences threatened the stability of civilization, condemning it to utter destruction. The end of the century was an enormous stage for such inglorious struggles. All the social sciences were called to great debates on capitalism and labor. But where were the moral forces capable of performing the great miracle of elucidating all minds? The Roman Church, which had nourished Western civilization since its birth, was by necessity the entity indicated to resolve the problem. After the statements of the syllabus and after the famous speech by Bishop Strossmayer in 1870 at the Vatican, when Pius IX decreed papal infallibility, such a role became very difficult for the Church. However, Leo XIII entered the fray with the encyclical Rerum Novarum in an attempt to reconcile labor and capital, assigning to each one its sacred duties. If the effect of this document held considerable importance for the most cultured classes of both the old and new worlds, such was not the case for the most disavowed classes, who had had enough of mere words.
Okay, so there is a lot of things in 3 paragraphs here. So let's divide. Let's start with socialism, okay? As many of you know, socialism / communism came from Karl Marx. Basically, who launched the Communist Manifest in 1848, Communist Manifesto, and then the 3-volume Das Kapital that was published between 1867 and 1883. So the idea was that the capitalism that existed in the 19th century was a capitalism of oppression, and that was destroying and oppressing the labor classes. So he created a manifesto where the workers would rule the countries and abolish the dominant classes. The first that we have to understand here, Karl Marx was also part of that group of spirits that was supposed to come here and promote the changes in society. That in that famous reunion that we read a couple of months ago between Napoleon and Kardec, that it is in the book Light Ahead, through the psychography of Brother X, Humberto de Campos, he talks about the meeting between Napoleon and Kardec, and Karl Marx was there also. He was, the idea here, his ideas that he was supposed to bring to humanity were ideas of equality that Spiritism has brought also. But what he didn't take into consideration when he incarnated, he discarded completely the moral / religious aspect of it, and used his ideas as an imposition. So he created a war of classes, which was not what he was supposed to bring. So he deviated from the original ideas that he was supposed to bring to humanity. But you know, in terms of the ideas that he brought, if you look at the social democrat countries in Europe nowadays that are the most advanced countries in the world, and the Scandinavian countries, and a little bit south of New Zealand, their political regiments have a lot to do with some ideas that Karl Marx brought. The problem is that you cannot impose, you cannot force from outwards to in these ideas. You cannot subjugate people to impose your ideas, because this only causes wars, and that's what happened throughout throughout the 20th century, and we still have today. We still have communist countries. We have 5 communist countries still in the world, despite the communist regime being almost completely abolished. You still have China, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, and North Korea under communist regimes, oppressing the population and not allowing liberty of expression. So Marx at that time didn't make any difference between socialism and communism. Later, it became more divided, because communism became the idea where the state runs everything, and the people doesn't own any property or anything. Everything belongs to the state, and the state distributes according to its own rules. And that the problem with an imperfect society, imperfect human beings that we are, is that you know, you have the famous book by George Orwell, the Animal Republic, the Republic of Animals. I forgot the title in English. That you know, in the end, what you create and what communism creates in all the countries that it rules is that you have 2 classes: the class that govern and the rest. And socialism, eventually, it became as it got a little bit more freedom from communism, it became a more free society. Well, there is more interference of the government than in the capitalism, but it doesn't impose anything. It doesn't force the population to follow it. It's more of a democratic process. So these countries in the Scandinavian countries, most are democratic. They're the social democrat countries, right? So ideas that Marx brought were, there were some important ideas. And it's interesting that here in the United States, his ideas were published by Mr. Horace Greeley in the New York Tribune. And why I say it's interesting. He didn't fully agree with Karl Marx's ideas, but his Tribune was very liberal journal, and he opened it to publish to many different ideas. So he said that he thought that Marx's ideas were not completely right, but there were interesting ideas. And why did I bring Horace Greeley? Because, as Jussara can talk a little bit better, he was the one that sponsored one of the Fox sisters, took her in his home, and eventually took her to Europe when I think was Katie Fox, if I'm not mistaken, Jussara.
Yes, Katie Fox.
Yes. So, you know, I found it very interesting that he was the one that published Marx here, and he was also the one that, you know, promoted, it says here, he promoted utopian reforms such as socialism, vegetarianism, agrarianism, feminism, and also spiritualism. So this is Horace Greeley that published Karl Marx here in the US. So that is socialism and communism a little bit. The second paragraph, when Emmanuel talks about the church, right? The Roman Church was losing more and more power. The Congress of Vienna that we mentioned allowed the church to continue having their own kingdom around where today you find Vatican, the Rome, and some other parts of Italy. But the domination of the church, political domination of the church throughout Europe, pretty much ceased to exist. It continued to rule in terms of religion, but it no longer rule in terms of political, except for the small part of Italy that dominate. So what happens? The church tries to keep this domination using a stronger religious impositions, and that's what Emmanuel talks about here. The syllabus, the statements of the syllabus, that was a document issued by Pope Pius IX, where he decreed the infallibility of the Pope. And it condemned a total of 80 errors or heresies, articulating the teaching of the Catholic Church in a number of philosophical and political questions. So, because they could no longer rule politically the other countries in Europe, they decided to call a lot of their actions heresies and condemning them. So one of the things that they were condemning, pantheism, naturalism, rationalism, socialism, communism, secret societies, Bible societies, and other things. So they talk about the marriage, the civil power, forms of liberalism, things that were accepted by the church and not accepted by the church. Bishop Strossmayer was one that came with when he said here, a famous speech, he made a very strong speech against the papal infallibility. And that created a lot of noise at that time. But in the end, later he retreated his speech. So in the beginning, it was kind of a controversial. First, he came strongly against the church, and then he kind of walked back on his words. Then you have here the Rerum Novarum, which means revolutionary change, or rights and duties of capital and labor. Why did the church came with this? Because the consequence of Marxism that was spreading, the ideas that were spreading by the end of the 19th century, you had no Marxist countries, but the seeds were already going throughout Europe. Marx spent his last years in London, and with a lot of the publications that from London to the rest of the of Europe, especially, and even other countries. So the church thought it was important to issue an encyclical that addressed the issues of socialism and political regimen. So the church rejected in this Rerum Novarum both socialism and unrestricted capitalism, and supported the rights of labor to form unions. So the church tried to be in the middle of the dispute, meaning the middle way, which is ideally the way that we should follow, right? Because you don't go to the extremes. Extremes only create conflicts. But of course, the church affirmed the right of private property. The church owner of so many private property was never going to be against private property like Marx and the communists spread the ideas at that time, right? So it was an important document. It was a document that still was updated until John 23rd in 1961, and John Paul II in 1991. They published updates to this Rerum Novarum. John 23 was called Mater and Magistra, and John Paul II was called the Centesimus Annus, 100 years of it was the anniversary of the publication. So it is still a very important document for the Catholic Church. That is still used nowadays to many of the resolutions of the Catholic Church. Okay, a lot of information here, a lot of historical information. Any comments, questions here? Really? Nothing? Okay. With this, we practically finished the historical aspects of the 20th century, everything that happened historically. And now we're going to get a little bit more in Spiritism. Okay. Philip.
Reestablishing the truth. Uh-oh. Top line I can't see. Hang on.
Thus,
Spiritism came
at
psychological time of great transformations, animating the human spirit so that the sacred fruit of all those who had labored and suffered in the painful development of civilization would not be lost. With the proofs of the soul's survival after death, Spiritism came to rehabilitate the Christianity that the church had distorted, sowing once again the eternal teachings of Christ in people's hearts. With the truths of reincarnation, it explained the absurdity of absolute egalitarian theories and worked on restoring the true way of human progress, framing socialism within Christian postulates. It had no illusions concerning external reforms and concluded that the only meaningful renewal was that of the inner self, the living core of the social organism down through time, striving for the intensification of educational activities in the eternal light of the gospel of Christ, teaching the law of compensation on the path of redemption, as well as the trials of the individual and the collectivity. Spiritism implemented the regime of responsibility, wherein each spirit had to enrich the list of its own qualities. Due to its understanding of individual effort and labor, it was not deceived by the utopias of absolute equality, and because of its awareness of the imperatives of human solidarity, it did not become an instrument of oppression for the magnates of wealth and power. It was unconcerned with all revolutions because only evolution was its arena of activity and experience, and it kept its distance from all wars due to its understanding of the fraternal ties that unite the universal community. Instead, it taught true human and national, familial, and group fraternity, enlarging the concepts of economic justice and correcting the fanatical spirit of extremist ideologies. During those dolorous times, when the most painful transitions faced the human spirit, only Spiritism could represent the moral quality upon which the support needed to build the future could be found. While the utopias of outward reform surrendered to the guardianship of ruthless dictators and their sinister revolutionary adventures, as in the case of Russia and Germany, Spiritism pursued its instructional endeavor with the intellectual classes and
the nameless suffering masses as it prepared the world of tomorrow with the imperishable light of Christ's teachings.
Thank you.
Okay, so now, after all these historical lessons, we come to what does Spiritism brings to the table, right? So Spiritism, as Emmanuel says here, and remember, this book was written in 1938, okay? So this is before the Second World War. And you see later when he talks about European war, not the First World War, because there was First World War was just named First World War after the Second World War, right? Because they didn't know there wasn't going to be another one. It was called the European War before that. So Spiritism comes at this psychological time of great transformations. The biggest transformations in society definitely came in the 19th century, because we moved from a complete domination of the church and absolutism in most of the countries to some first stages of democracy. This country here had democracy, selective democracy, if we can call that, right? Democracy for the ones that were not slaves, but a form of democracy from the independence. Other countries were already starting to have some experience with democracy. England or United Kingdom has a sort of democracy in terms of the parliament for very long time, the House of Lords and House of Commons having the ability to rule parts of the country, and other countries in Europe also, France on and off experimenting with democracy. And besides that, science and the greatest advancement of science, scientific advancements in the 19th century, the separation from the church. And that's when Spiritism comes, because it was the right time for it to be accepted and not completely oppressed. I always joke that if Spiritism had come 100 years before, Kardec would be burned at stake, right? So he could, in the 19th century, Spiritism had an opening to be accepted. But as Emmanuel says here, and we are going to go through each teaching of Spiritism and compare to what was happening. So Spiritism first comes to rehabilitate Christianity that church has distorted, meaning Spiritism bring us back to the original teachings of Jesus and the moral teachings of Jesus, which are the teachings that we are supposed to follow, and that the church meaning us, we distorted along the way. And Spiritism brings the eternal teachings of Christ. When you read the gospel according to Spiritism, these are eternal teachings, are the moral teachings of Jesus, and these are teachings that will never be changed, because they are moral teachings that can be applied to every epoch of humankind. Spiritism brings the notion of reincarnation, and with reincarnation, it brings the idea that we are all the same, and we bring the idea of our evolutionary path, that we are going to go through different experiences in different genders, in different races. So we learn that we will learn to love our universal family as we love ourselves. But also the absurdity of absolute egalitarian theories. What is he talking about here? The imposition of egalitarian theories. We are all the same, as imposed by what the communists were doing at the time, that you forced egalitarian theories. And Spiritism teaches us, if we are all the same on day one, on day two, because of our personal difference, we are not all the same. Some people will move forward in different paths than other people, because we are all different and we are all at different stages of evolution. So it is impossible to impose absolute egalitarian theories. So that's what Spiritism brings to us, the understanding of respecting one another, but understanding the differences, that there will be people that will be richer or poorer, more prepared, less prepared, will evolve in different avenues of progress. So Emmanuel says here that there is a lot of socialism ideas that combine with Spiritism, as long as it comes from inner self, from inwards to outwards, not outward forced into the incarnated, because we would have problems accepting things that are imposed that we don't agree. It has to become part of who we are. The learning and understanding has to become part of who we are. So Spiritism teaches us the law of compensation, meaning cause and consequence, the trials of the individuality and the collectivity, right? Of course, when we talk about slavery in this country created a karma for itself with slavery. Other countries also created karmas with different crimes against humanity, right? And we know that Europe, with all the wars, ended up losing a lot of the spiritual teachings and rulings. Spiritism appeared in France, and it moved away from Europe because of all the wars and everything that happened in Europe, especially in the beginning of the 20th century. So Spiritism brings us the notion of responsibility, where each one of us is responsible for their own actions, and we live with causes and consequences. We are responsible for our actions. We will have to face the consequences positive and negative of our actions. So, as Emmanuel says here, Spiritism is not concerned with the human revolutions, because our evolution is personal in activity and experience, and impositions and dominations does not help us progress. Only fraternal union helps us progress, the universal community, right? And finally, when he mentions here that utopists of outward reform surrender to the guardianship of ruthless dictators, again, we have to remember we're talking here 1938, when we had Stalin dominating Russia and imposing a very oppressive regime, and Hitler in Germany starting the movements that what would become the Second World War and the Nazi movement. So the extreme left and the extreme right dominating two of the largest countries in Europe, that the consequence would be the Second World War. When Emmanuel writes this book, we still didn't have the war. But he talks about Spiritism pursuing the instructional endeavor with the intellectual classes and the nameless suffering masses. So it means it applies to everyone, for all those that are willing to learn and understand about our personal path of evolution, our personal journey, which is in the end, it's what counts on our spiritual and moral evolution, moral intellectual evolution. Okay. Okay. Questions here in Spiritism, the role of Spiritism in everything of this. I mentioned this on Thursday. I'm going to mention again when we talk about reincarnation and in this country. Spiritualism in this country was very spread in the 19th century, and the idea of spirit what is spiritualism? It's a religious movement based on the belief that the spirits of dead exist and have the ability and inclination to communicate with the living. So the afterlife or the spirit world is seen by a spiritualist not as a static place, but as one in which spirits continue to evolve. So you see that the basic belief of spiritualism is what Spiritism also believes and teaches. Now, the problem with spiritualists, one of the issues and that we face here is that they believe that the contact with spirits is possible, but they believe that spirits are more advanced than humans. That spirits are capable of providing useful knowledge about moral and ethical issues, as well as the nature of God, which is right, partially, right? Because there are spirits that are more advanced than humans, but there are many spirits that are less advanced than humans because it's just us on the other side. So what Kardec brought in the teachings of Spiritism was going further into understanding the nature of the spirits in the spiritual world. Spiritualism developed and reached its peak from 1840s to the 1920s, especially in the English-speaking countries. And it is said that in 1897, spiritualism had more than 8 million followers in the United States and Europe, mostly from middle and upper classes. Okay, and spiritualists and those that watched Rusara's lecture on the Sisters Fox and the development of spiritualists here in this country in the 19th century, they supported causes as abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and it continues to exist here in different, it's called Spiritualist Church in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Now, again, the problem is that they believe that all communications from the spirits are coming from more evolved spirits, and we know that communications from the spirits can come from more evolved and less evolved. But I mentioned spiritualism here because one of the problems with reincarnation in this country in the 19th century, and Kardec mentions this in the Spiritist Review, is that for Americans to accept reincarnation would create a problem for those that would think that they could be born as slaves in the following incarnation. And that was going to be an impediment to the dissemination of Spiritism/spiritualism here in this country. That's why reincarnation was not well spread here in the US when Spiritism and spiritualism came to spread here. Okay. Comments, questions? Jussara, anything to add here on this century, that on this part of spiritualism and in the 19th century here?
That's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else?
The only thing that I would add is I found the title of the topic very appropriate and very humbled and truthful, with reestablishing the truth, which basically restates here that Spirit is not bringing this truth, is not revealing this truth, is not creating this truth, it's reestablishing, it's bringing back what was already revealed to us. And for many reasons got lost or got deviated or got altered somehow in what Spiritism, and somehow we studied here through this book how actually all this deviation, all those aberrations have been removed or added to the truth. And what Spiritism does is bring simplicity to the truth, reestablish what has already been revealed to us, the concepts of reincarnation, all the divine laws that is studied in the Spirit's book, all have been there all along. I think the beauty of Spiritism is the ability to pack everything together in a very simple form for all of us to understand and follow. I mean, to follow is hard, but at least to understand.
Yes. Yeah, very good point, Elmo. Thanks. Anyone else? Okay.
The apostasy of the Catholic Church. Starting in 1870, the year that signaled the decadence of the Church in virtue of its spiritual apostasy from fulfilling the great responsibilities that the Lord had entrusted to it in apostolic times, a period of profound transitions marked all human activities. In vain had the world waited for the Christian accomplishments begun during Constantine's reign. Allied with the state and dining at the table of its economic interests, the Church cared about nothing but its own perishable reign. It had forgotten about God and never did try to match the evolution of the physical individual to the spiritual individual. Rather, it held to the contemptible, petty interests of temporal politics. That is why the direst omens now hovered over its head.
When we talk about Emmanuel and the Church, we know that Emmanuel has been part of the Church for many incarnations. In the book Renunciation, he was a priest. We know that he was one of the founders of the city of São Paulo, as Manuel da Nóbrega, incarnated in Brazil, incarnated in Portugal, but living in Brazil in the 1500s. He has a very dire view of the Church and all the deviations of the Church. But the first thing here, I didn't know what it meant, and I probably some of you don't know what apostasy means. I didn't know, so I had to go and look for it. It means the abandonment or renunciation of a religious or political belief. So what he's saying is that the church abandoned this, the religious mission, in a sense, starting in 1870. Why 1870? I mentioned earlier, it was when they declared the infallibility of the Pope. So the Pope was the representation of God on earth, and everything that the Pope says is the absolute truth. And, you know, the Pope is human, right? We know through Spiritism that we are all humans here, and we all have imperfections, and we all have our shortcomings. So of course the Pope cannot be infallible. And this creates an issue when the church proclaims that the Pope is infallible. It creates a problem, because all those that do not accept it consequently we will have more difficulty accepting the teachings of the church. So here the Catholic Church started to lose their domination of its followers, which is one thing that until today we see that the church continues to lose those true followers because of the dogmas, because of the impositions. Still, it has the Christianity divided between the Catholic, the Protestants, and other denominations. Still had a large part of the population of the earth. I think it's like 3 billion or 2 billion, 3 billion of people declare themselves Christians, which all the denominations. But those that really follow the teachings of the church are less and less in terms of numbers. And Emmanuel says here that the problem was the church itself, because instead of following the true teachings of Christ, it started to align itself with the state and dining at the table of its economic interests, meaning the church was more concerned and has been more concerned with their own preservation of their own riches than with the spiritual teaching of those that are looking for spiritual consolation and understanding. And Emmanuel is rather aggressive here when he says it had forgotten about God and never did try to match the evolution of the physical individual to the spiritual individual. And rather it held to the contemptible petty interests of temporal politics, which is, you know, in a sense, he is right, because the church is on and off has focused a lot on the material life and the life in the physical world, and had given less importance to our spiritual side, which should be the main and only focus of the church, right? Our spiritual evolution and our spiritual connection in terms of the church, with God and with the saints, with Jesus, and they do that, but in such a formal way that it becomes very difficult for many people to follow the church and to believe in the teachings of the church. So that's Emmanuel's view what was happening with the church, and what in many ways continues to be the issue with many of not only with the Catholic Church, but with the organized religions, when they try to impose their own truths, and that they create dogmas and impositions. It makes it very hard for many people to continue following. Not for everybody. There are those that still accept and then follow it. And if they are comfortable with what we always say in Spiritism, if they are comfortable in their own religion, there is no reason for us to try to force them to change, because we need to find our spiritual comfort, and if they can find that in their own beliefs, in their own church, as long as they don't become radicalized, which is a problem for many religions, there is nothing wrong with that. Actually, there is. It's very positive that they find spiritual comfort in whatever they believe. Okay, Luis.
Well, I just want to point out something. I find it very interesting, the semantic game and the word game that Emmanuel used here, when he called the spiritual apostasy of the church. Why this is interesting? Actually, the church was used to accuse others of apostasy. Actually, in the Dark Ages, one of the things that you really did not want to happen to you is being accused of apostasy, of abandoning the faith to the church. That usually means that in a very unpleasant way. So what Emmanuel is doing here is throwing it back to the Catholic Church, accusing it of apostasy, of a spiritual apostasy, of abandoning the ideas entrusted to it in the apostolic times. I find it a great thing to say. Well, that's it.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. It's very interesting that you brought the medieval times, and yes, the church. A lot of the responsibilities that the church carried, and until these days, and the causes a lot of the problems that many of us still have is what the church did in the persecutions and of the Dark Ages. It's the cause of that many people unconsciously reject religion nowadays, because they went through the traumas of those experiences in previous incarnations, right? Something that is very noticeable in those that have an issue with religion. And so yes, go ahead, Elmo.
But more than point fingers at the church, it does reflect our ignorance during this period of time, that we surrendered so easily to this pseudo-Christianities. I'm primarily interested in the teachings of Christ here, but that we so easily surrendered to the falsehoods presented to us without any resistance, or mild resistance that happened during a certain period of time, that being quickly abolished by the church, but in yet it reveals our ignorance to surrender, to allow this falsehoods to prevail for such a long time, as find out for us more comfortable to just go along than to try to fight somewhat for the truth. I think if the church gains so much power is because we, ignorant spirits, surrender that power to them.
Very true. And we are facing the consequence of our own actions there, right? That's the reality, right? There is no escape of facing the consequence of our own actions, as individually and collectively. Okay, anyone else? Okay, Philip.
Renewing struggles. The 20th century dawned on the horizon of the globe as a time full of renewing struggles. Social theories continued to make headway, often touching the dark curve of extremism, but revelations from beyond the grave were descending on souls like immaterial dew, foretelling the peace and light of a new age. Numerous transformations were anticipated, and Spiritism enlightened people's hearts, renewing their spiritual personality for the approaching future. The European Sino-Russian wars of 1914-1918 were harbingers of an even greater struggle in the not too far off future, when the planet will rid itself of all the rebellious spirits who have been galvanized in crime and who have not known how to take advantage of the gift of so many millennia in the sacred patrimony of time. Then planet Earth, just like the far-off world of Capella, will be freed of spirits hardened in evil, because the human beings of radio telephony and transatlantic exchange need both soul and sentiment, so that they do not prevent the sacred victories of progress. The spirits who remain on the planet will be those who have grasped the lesson of love and fraternity under the guidance of Jesus, whose mercy has been the word of life and light from the beginning. A time of bitter struggle from the start of this century, war has entrenched itself permanently in nearly every region of the planet. The League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles, as well as all peace pacts, have been nothing but phenomena of war itself, which will end only with the apogee of such fratricidal conflicts in the process of the final selection of the spiritual expressions of life on earth.
Okay. So here we're talking, Emmanuel is talking already on the 20th century, right? Beginning of the 20th century. And it's important to remind everyone that this book is from 1938. So very recent at the time that it was written, everything that Emmanuel is writing here, right? So he talks about the extremism, and we know that we had we talked before about Russia and Germany, but the transformations that Spiritism announces are starting to take place, and more and more people are starting to pay attention to their spiritual truth. Now he talks here, and that's what I mentioned before, the European War of 1940-1980, 1914-1918, which is the First World War. At that time, that was not called the First World War. But he talks about, and also the Sino-Russian War, which is the war between Russia and China there. It all started very early in the century with the wars, with a battle that we're going to see shortly, called the Battle of Port Arthur in China. That was the first Chinese-Japanese War in 1894. So Emmanuel mentions here the transformation of Earth, the Earth going from a planet of trials and expiations to a world of regeneration. And he mentions here that, like what happened to Capella, that the less evolved spirits were brought to Earth in the immigrations of 10,000 years ago that created Egypt and other advanced civilizations. Earth will be freed from spirits hardened in evil, because they can no longer belong to this planet as a planet of regeneration. And we see this happening, still happening. The last book from Divaldo, On the Way of a World of Regeneration, that is being published in English in the next couple of weeks already, is almost ready. You see him talking, Manuel Filomeno de Miranda, talking about whole communities of spirits being transported from the lower zones to more primitive planets. So, and he specifically says, these are spirits hardened in evil, meaning they don't want to change their behavior, because spirits that are doing evil because they are following others, it's not who they really are, but just it's more convenient for them. These are not the spirits that are being sent to less evolved planets. The spirits that are being sent are the leaders, the ones that are insisting on doing evil and conducting others to do evil. So Emmanuel says here that the spirits who will remain on this planet will be those who have grasped the least lesson of love and fraternity under the guidance of Jesus. It's important here, he doesn't say that it's those that are practicing the lesson of love and fraternity. Those that have grasped, meaning they understand it, they may have not put in practice on their daily lives, they are still struggling with their imperfections, but all of us that have understood at least the seeds of the teachings of Jesus of love and fraternity will be those that will continue to live on this planet and continue to progress with this planet. And again, this is the vast majority of the population of Earth, okay? That's very important. It's not that the vast population of Earth is being removed. The vast population of Earth, both incarnated and discarnated, remains on this planet. Those that are trying to disrupt the progress, they are insistent on doing evil, are hardened in evil, as Emmanuel says, are those that are being removed from this planet. And Emmanuel finishes by talking about the struggle in the beginning of the 20th century, where most of the world had wars. The League of Nations is the organization that existed before the United Nations between the First and Second World War. Was an embryonic trial of union between the nations, ended up not working that well. But the Treaty of Versailles was the treaty between France and Germany to end the war that took care of divisions, but eventually only created more disputes between Germany and France that then ended up causing also the Second World War that will be later after this book was published. But he says here that this will end only with the apogee of such fratricidal conflicts in the process of final selection of the spiritual expressions of life on Earth, meaning that those conflicts will separate those that are going to stay here and those that are going to be sent to a less evolved planet to continue their journey of evolution. The law is of progress. Even those that are hardened in evil will eventually recognize their own errors and will progress also, will find a way maybe to come back to Earth, or maybe continue their journey in this less evolved world and help the progress of this less evolved world. Okay? Any comments, questions here?
Hey, João.
Yes, Anato.
Just curious. Since our world is a reflection of the spiritual world, and you were talking about spirits being removed to an inferior world, and here, for example, just to make a point, if you take a drug dealer out the street, next day, another one appears because power and control. So if you take all these bad spirits to a different world, and this world is changed to a regeneration, so does that mean that those, not, still bad spirits, but they understand that Jesus comes and everything, they won't, how could be a word in here? They won't be inclined to get to the point that those that were removed from here?
Yeah, the idea is more or less that, Renato, meaning there are spirits, you know, you talk about the drug dealers, right? You have the leaders of the gangs and those that use it for their own profit, that because they are forced to, but they're not doing it out of evil inclinations. They're doing it for survival, for convenience, for selfish reasons. So it's just a matter of moving, helping and assisting them and pointing them to the right direction, and they will change. It's not a very difficult effort to change. The leaders are the ones that are not going to change because they are the ones that they do it for the evil purposes of it. So yes, Divaldo says that we just need 500 more evolved spirits to incarnate in key positions on Earth to change the whole planet, right? So the large number of spirits that still act on their selfish tendencies, but they're not evil per se, they're just selfish. They just need proper guidance to change, to start the path of changing. Again, change is not overnight, but if you start making an effort to change, and we all have been making an effort to change, and we all know that it's not easy, we struggle to change, but if we walk in trying to change, eventually we will succeed. So these are spirits, the spirits that will remain on Earth at the end of this transition will be spirits that that have the seeds of change in them, and that will make an effort to change if they have the right approach. Again, a planet of regeneration is where goodness prevails over evil. Doesn't mean that evil does not exist, because you still have those spirits that will fall into their imperfect tendencies and act on their imperfect tendencies and cause evil and do evil actions, but they are not evil per se. They are just fall to their imperfections and allow them to take the best of them. You know, it's a slight difference. Sometimes it's not very easy to perceive, but there is a difference. Okay.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, so here now we come to us, the Americas and the future. You're on mute, Philip.
Although compelled to take part in upcoming struggles due to the determinism of the circumstances of their political life, the Americas are destined to receive the scepter of civilization and culture to guide the peoples of the future. The nations of Europe will gather around the Americas' economical storehouses to take advantage of the pain-filled efforts of those who fell for the development of Western civilization for the edification of the spiritual human being, who is to supplant the physical being with a full understanding of the great problems of being and destiny. For this grand desideratum, the spirit realm is getting ready for the great effort of clarifying the noble duties of the Americas. The sincere effort of cooperation in the labor and construction of peace is not a utopia there, just as it is not in Europe, saturated with multi-secular prejudices. The seeds of light of the marvelous tree of the civilization of the future are being planted in the lush fields of the Americas.
Oh, Emmanuel says that here, it's our responsibility here, right? The Americas. And it's very interesting because in 1938, when he wrote this book, of course, the US was already a very powerful country, but was not the center of the world as it is nowadays, right? The United States dominates economically the world, and the influences in terms of everything that happens here influences the rest of the world. So again, we still live in a world of trials and regeneration. So not everything that comes out of this country is perfect, or it's far from it. There's a lot of things that need to be improved. But what Emmanuel is saying here, that Europe, that during centuries and centuries was the center of the world, would cede this being the center of the world to Europe, to the Americas. And of course, the United States today is considered economically to be economically and even politically and socially, in many cases, considered to be the center of the world. So he's just advising us of the transition from Europe to the Americas, of the point of emanating everything, and brings to us here the responsibility of taking care of what we say and do, because it ends up reflecting in the rest of the world. Okay. Comments, questions here? Okay, the last item of this chapter, Jesus. Go ahead, Philip.
Jesus. There is an unprecedented movement of armaments and munitions in the world. Has this movement just begun? No. The arms race of the 20th century started before the Battle of Port Arthur in 1904. The war industry has reached unforeseen heights. The fields are deserted. Men have gathered on the battlefield waiting for the enemy without realizing that the real enemy is in their own spirit. Europe and the East are a vast arena of aggression and terrorism, except for the democratic republics, which are compelled to rearmament due to the Moloch of extremism. Where are humankind's moral values? The churches are stifled by economic and political injunctions. Only Spiritism, renouncing all earthly warranties, is making the valiant effort of keeping aglow the light of belief on this fragile ship of humanity that is unaware of its glorious destiny, a ship that threatens to return to the currents of force and violence rather than the illuminated shores of reason, learning, and human rights. We must concur that Spiritism's efforts are almost greater than its strength, but the world is not at the disposal of earthly dictators. Jesus is its sole leader in the realm of immortal realities. And now that the world holds so many anguishing expectations, the regions closest to the earth are busy reestablishing truth and peace on the road to a new age. Selfless and enlightened spirits have told us about a new meeting of the community of angelic powers of the solar system, of which Jesus is one of the divine members. This heavenly society will meet again in the atmosphere of the earth for the third time, the first since Christ received the sacred mission. I can't read the top line.
Of embracing and redeeming our humanity, once more deciding on the fate of our world.
What will result from the conclave of angels of the infinite, only God knows. In the great transitions of this 20th century, let us wait for his love and mercy.
So Emmanuel here talks about what was happening in the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, that started, as I said before, with the Battle of Port Arthur, which is between Japan and Russia in the shores of China. Port Arthur is nowadays it's in Manchuria, China, and it's I forgot the name that he has today. And of course, at that time, the war industry that was building, especially as everyone was preparing for the Second World War. He talks about Europe and East, aggression and terrorism. The war spread from Europe to Asia. Remember, the United States entered the war just in the final 2 years, the Second World War, when Japan bombarded Hawaii. Forgot the name of the Pearl Harbor. And Emmanuel questions, what are humankind's moral values? What Spiritism can bring is again bringing reason, learning, and human rights instead of the dark forces that were dominating Earth at that time. And it's interesting when it says that Spiritism efforts are almost greater than its strength. And sometimes we still feel that we are talking to nobody, right, in Spiritism, because of how small Spiritism is compared to other religious movements. But again, the work is to continue to spread and to not to believe that the truth will prevail in the end, right? As Emmanuel says here, Jesus, it's the sole leader in the realm of immortal realities, and enlightened spirits have told Emmanuel about a new meeting of angelic powers. I don't remember reading anything else about this meeting, but we know that the governor of this planet, Jesus, it's never going to leave us alone, and will continue to guide and direct. And what will happen, as Emmanuel says here, let us wait for his love and mercy of Jesus to continue our journey. And what we can do is do our part. Okay? Final comments, questions here? Okay, so before we finish here, I would like to invite you all for next Sunday for a special lecture by our friend Luis Leon. Can you tell us what is the subject, Luis?
Sure. Thank you for the invitation. Next Sunday, I shall be speaking to you here for SGNY. We'll talk about the consequences of Spiritist knowledge. That's something, in my opinion, is very important to us as Spiritists. I hope to bring, a few texts from a few books that you probably have never read before, and maybe, of all the things I might share with you, one or two things might touch your heart. So be here. We need an audience, please. Philip.
Looking forward.
Bring the earth behind you.
So next Sunday, 11 a.m. Special lecture by Luis. Okay, so it will be a lecture, but of course we will have time for discussions with questions and everything, right? Like all our studies. Okay. And besides that, I think that's all for the announcements. Wayne, yes, welcome aboard.
Thank you. It was a very nice time that I've spent here with you. Philip, thank you very much for reading so well. It makes things go smoothly. Reading this book, you know that the Earth or the universe is progressing similar to the individual. We go forward, we have problems, we go forward again, but it's sort of depressing in a way when you put this all together in this book, that you see the many opportunities through the course of Earth's history that we've missed those chances of advancement. That we know we have this in our life, but you thought prior to reading this book, I didn't understand clearly how the earth is so similar to the individual, and we've had numerous civilizations have prospered and then have fallen, and I see things that are happening today, and I think, oh, here we go again. This is going to be one of our setbacks, and so I hope that we can spread Spiritism sooner than later, so that we can alter the outcome, or at least have advancement sooner. But it was very nice to be here, and I'll see you again, definitely.
Thanks, Wayne. And I know of the work that you've been trying to do in disseminating Spiritism, and we appreciate also your effort, and thank you for joining us. So Zoraida, can you do our final prayer? Or mute.
Yes, absolutely. To our beloved Christ Jesus, to our spiritual benefactors that have come here in the teachings on the way of light. We are so grateful to understand the great transitions that Spiritism has gone through, and where we're at now today, still working, learning, and aspiring to our Christ, our light. We thank you, dear Lord, for the understanding of each and every one of us in the studies of Spiritism. May we continue with our prayers in helping the outside world, where there is so much suffering still to be had. Allow us, dear Father, to give light to all those that are going through so much difficulties, pain, and suffering. May we continue with our prayers throughout the week, joining our study groups and understanding who we really are as Spiritists. We are grateful for the light. We are grateful to give light as much as we can to all our loved ones, our families, our friends, and even those that don't care much for us. We thank you, dear Lord, and may we continue throughout the week with our prayers and return again next week. We are grateful for the teachers who continuously give light to all of each and every one of us. May God bless the United States Spiritist Federation, the United States Spiritist Councils, and all that have contributed to all our enlightenment and studies. Dear Lord, and as we come to the end of our meeting, we give you thanks and ask permission to close our meeting today. So be it.